Chinese history is organized into dynastic eras. And we've already looked at the Shang Dynasty, which is the Bronze Age in China. And now we're going to be looking at the Qin Dynasty. And this is an era that ushered in many innovations and advancements. But it occurred after 2.5 centuries of a warring states period, which was a very tumultuous time in Chinese history. And you see that era right here on this timeline. But the order was finally restored by Qin Shi Huangdi, and he becomes the first emperor of China. And this is the period of the Great Wall, a unified currency, a standard unit of measure, and a centralized bureaucracy. But Emperor Qin also used brutal tactics to consolidate power. He repressed all other schools of thought other than legalism, which meant that absolute obedience had to be paid to the state's authority. He replaced feudal lords with salaried administrators, which meant that it was a meritocracy that privileged merit over birth. And here are some of the famous advancements and achievements of the Qin Dynasty. Again, there was a standardized currency and standardized measurements, but also a standardized language and writing, which really ushered in an age in which we could talk about China as a nation. And you'll notice that the word Qin, Q-U-I-N, is the root of the word China. There were also major public works, such as the Great Wall, but also roads and irrigation canals, which allowed for movement throughout the territory and trade. In 1974, there was one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries ever made anywhere, when farmers digging a well in the village of Lingtan in the Shaanxi province discovered a huge tomb. During Qin's lifetime, he began constructing an absolutely mammoth, grandiose tomb that would become his home in the afterlife. This undertaking, scholars think, probably took more than 700,000 laborers. And I'm showing you here a view of the covered excavation site, which only represents about 20% of what is thought to be there. So only a fraction of it has been excavated at this point. There are 2,000 figures that have been unearthed, but it's thought that there's probably more than 8,000. And this tomb, which is actually really an underground city, encompasses 38 square miles. You see here that it is an army of figures. They are larger than life size. There are soldiers and there are horses. There are chariots and archers, all made of terracotta. And each one of them is distinct and different. Although some of the figures' bodies may look the same, each head is distinct and are portraits of actual people. They are standing in for people who would act as bodyguards. And previously, in funerary rites, these people might have been expected to be buried with their leader. So you can imagine that this is actually quite a nice thing to have a terracotta figure of yourself buried with the leader than having to be buried alive with him. Here's another view in which you can see the figures are in different postures, and even though they seem lined up in rows in a military formation, you can see that the faces are quite distinct. Some of them have facial hair, some of them have different hairstyles, and they can be really seen both as a huge group of people that would have protected the leader, but also as individuals. Probably the most interesting aspect of the entire burial complex is that it suggests that Qin himself, as a young emperor, was obsessed with immortality. And he was driven to almost conquer death itself by creating a situation in which he would be marching into the afterlife with an army. Qin ascended to the throne at the age of 13, and apparently he immediately began to plan for his burial, and most importantly, an underground palace and mausoleum that would have been attended by this almost 8,000 figures. Here's another view of a group of soldiers in which you can see that there is a lot of variety in terms of the facial features. But you'll also notice that this picture in particular gives a little insight into how they were constructed. They would have had to have been made in massive, massive kilns, and so each figure was probably made of different sections that would have been assembled almost in an assembly line. So although the makers were intending quite a bit of variety, they would have been made in different parts, and then, for example, the torso would have made separate, and then a new head or a different head would have been plugged onto each figure. So again, despite the individuality of these figures, it seems that they were using an assembly line production system that paved the way for advances in mass production and commerce thousands of years later.